Good afternoon. This is Mary with DWD Technology Group here in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I wanted to spend a little time this afternoon sharing how you might reconcile your accounts payable or your accounts receivable detail information with your general ledger. And what happens with Sage 100, because it's a batch processing system, it means that you can actually have a document date that doesn't necessarily correlate with the same period of the general ledger. And when that happens, when that all gets posted like that, you end up with having what we call a timing discrepancy between the general ledger and the accounts receivable or payable reports. So what I want to talk about today is some things that I tend to look for when I run into a situation where the general ledger doesn't jive with the corresponding detail. And with Sage, we have a couple of reports that we can look at. In an ideal world, obviously, our general ledger would reconcile with our aging report, whether, of course, it be AP or AR. I'm going to start with AR this afternoon, and we can apply the same principles to accounts payable as we move forward. Because the accounts receivable aging report is actually a report that is based on the document date, with the invoice date, this report will show you one particular balance at the end of a period, but the actual GL balance may not correspond. So I'm going to run a report here. My test company is in the year 2025. So I'm going to run a report as of 5/31/2025. And we're going to see that we have information here. I'm going to zoom that a little bit for us. We've got our information on our invoices and finance charges and credit memos and the like. And when we look at our grand total of our invoices here, and that happens to be in this balance column, we see that we would expect a general ledger balance of $694,000 plus dollars. So what I compare that to then is I will look at the general ledger account for the accounts receivable, and I want to make sure that at the end of the period on which I'm reporting, we have that same balance. So I get the account maintenance open here, and I'm going to go ahead and pull open the receivables. Now, this particular company has East and West warehouses, so they've got two different GL accounts. And if you've got multiple GL accounts for your receivables or payables, when you run the report, unless you run the aging report specifically for one division or another, you're going to end up having to accumulate all the totals to get the grand total. So if we look at our East warehouse and we look at the history tab, I can see that my May period is my most current open period, and it has a balance of $548,000 and change. I'm going to go get my other report out of the West warehouse, and I'm going to look at these two totals here, and I'm going to have to see if they add up to the grand total that shows on my aging report. So we're looking at $145,000 and change and $548,000 and change. And we look at the balance of the report, $694,457.11. Well, that happens to balance. So we're pretty excited about that. Let's see if I can get these. There we go. Nope, that's going to not do that for me. So the 145, 481.21, and the 70, actually, it does not completely balance. So if we look at the math, I can tell here by looking at the last digits in the decimals, I'm off a little bit. If I do some quick addition here, 548, 651.70. I'm actually off by a few $100s. So this actually will give us a good example of some things that we want to look for. Knowing that this is a grand total for everything that's out in the general ledger, and if I look to the future, this is one of the first things that we do. I want to establish whether or not this is a timing difference or whether this is a transactional difference or what's going on. So the first thing I want to figure out is what is my, I call it an infinibalance balance. What is my most future general ledger balance that I can look at so that when I run an aging report out to the future or infinity, and I want to make sure those numbers compare. Because if those numbers compare, that basically means that you have a timing difference from one period to another. So again, excuse me, we have 694, 132.91, and because I cannot take a fiscal year any farther than the year 2026, I know that this is my infinibalance balance. Okay, so what I want to do next is I want to take a look at this report out to infinity. Well, how do I get a report out to infinity? My favorite is to call up the year, the month 1230 or month and date 1231 of the year 9,999. Don't know about you folks. I don't intend to be around that long. And so we're going to go ahead and take a look here at what this means for us in the future. And when we look at the grand total at the end, we can see that we actually are still off. We are representing the balance as it stood at the end of the May period for which we just ran the report. So the first thing that this tells me is that we don't have a timing difference, but we have some sort of a transactional difference. Okay. Now, there's another report that we can use, and I'll talk about it here in a minute. It's what's called the trial balance report. And this report will effectively look at the general ledger dates, and it will try to get you to figure out, hey, I'm in balance as of the period because my transactional dates are right. So in looking at this infinibalance balance and comparing it to the total of my AR account balance or balances, depending on if you're using multiple AR accounts, I still have a discrepancy of about $320 some. And it would be nice to find that because $320, yeah, it's money, and I don't like to not have money. So the next particular thing that I would do in hunting this down is I would actually take a look at the transactions that exist in my general ledger, and I would look from the last time that I had reconciled my general ledger to my aging or my trial balance report, and I would see if there are any miscellaneous types of transactions that may have occurred that don't belong in that particular account. The way I confirm that is I look at the source journals and I can see CR. That's a cash receipts journal. That's perfectly appropriate to land in the accounts receivable account. I might see an SO journal. Again, that is a perfectly reasonable account that should show up. I have an AR account, transaction journal. Of course, again, same thing. I've got some cash disbursement journals in here. That's a little odd. I wouldn't necessarily expect that, but there may be some rationale as to why that is the case. You'll notice there are a couple of other journals in here that aren't really familiar necessarily. One of them is this JE journal, and the JE journal is often set up as a manual source, a source of manual journal entries that you can post into Sage. So when you go into General Ledger main general journal entry, we often use a non-Sage Sage 100 source journal to reflect the entries that we posted, because it gives us some insight as to where the information has come from. And this SJ journal is something of the same nature. It is a made-up journal that we have created. It is not defaulted by Sage from any specific transactions, but it's a type of journal that we're using to have an effect on our accounts receivable accounts. So the first thing we look for is there a transaction that is not a typical journal that has had an effect on our accounts receivable balance, and we want to figure out whether it's appropriate or necessary. As I look through the other accounts receivable account, I have similar journals. I've got a couple of manual journal entries. There are some corrections that had been made along the way to get things brought up to speed. But in general, I'm not seeing that one transaction that reflects the fact that my general ledger is not balancing to the details that are provided. So with that, another thing I could look at, I'll go ahead and show it here, is the AR trial balance. And a lot of people get very spooked by this type of trial balance report because they're afraid that somebody's going to get in and actually see the results of the general ledger. Well, no, this is not what this report does. The general ledger's trial balance report is exclusive to the GL. So when you're considering permissions and things like that for your users, you want to make sure that the people who are responsible for the AR side or the AP side, they have access to this report, because this can help them find mistakes. So if I look at this trial balance report from the AR module, what we will see is a different view of the accounts receivable sales information. It's not arranged like our typical aging categories are, but it is arranged in such a way that we can have visibility into the transactions that affected AR during the course of the month. So as I look through this report, I can see I have an invoice number out here, and I have an invoice amount, and I can see that on 2/28 of 2025, this invoice got posted. And then on 3/31, I can see that another invoice was posted, but I also see that there is a different figure here on the invoice balance. Where did that come from? Well, it happened to come from this credit memo that was posted a couple of months later. So, okay, that stuff looks reasonable. And then, of course, as I go along, I would see various payments that had occurred, and we can see how those payments have been applied. If I look at this particular invoice here that has an invoice amount of $1,100, but yet its current balance is only $600, I make note that there was a $500 payment that fell within the period that I'm looking at. So that should all be relatively easy to follow. And the key thing that I want to point out on this particular report is that you have the ability to see the transaction dates, not only of the invoices. So I can say, yes, I match my invoice date with the period in which it posted. So that shouldn't give me any kind of a timing discrepancy. But I also see the payment dates that have an effect on the ending balance for the period I've run this report. And as we go through and we look at the balances here, I can see a lot of information about invoice amounts and discounts and whatnots, but the fields that I'm really most interested in are the invoice balance and the transaction amounts, where I get some idea of what's going on. Now, the good thing, if we think back to the aging report that we had, let me pull that back up so we can look at all of this together, is that our aging report and our trial balance report they both balance. So that gives me a little bit of confidence that there is potentially a journal entry adjustment that would be necessary in order to get everything else to balance. And these are the kinds of things that we want to look for in order to decide what do we need to correct and by how much. So if I get my trial balance report, you can see that its ending balance as of 5/31 matches the aging report. So my comfort level is that the details are correct and things fell within the proper period. As such, we will then go to the general ledger and we will post a general journal entry with the offsetting amount to get us to match what the total should be. So those are some things that I look for when I am trying to reconcile either accounts payable or accounts receivable for a given period. And just to show you some similarities on the accounts payable side, I'll pull up these same types of reports and I'll grab the same corresponding GLs. So we'll get our accounts payable here. There we go. So we have a summary account, we have a traded accounts payable, and we have an other accounts payable. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the trade accounts payable. And again, I'm going to look at the history. I'm going to go to the accounts payable module, and I want to pull up, first of all, the aging report. That's the one that most of us are familiar with. That's the one that's a little bit easier to read and a little bit easier to sort out. So most people do look at that report first, but I just want to share there are some other things that we can look at that will give us the ability to see a different viewpoint on those particular transactions. So if I pull up my payables report and I look at its ending balance, okay, I've got the invoice balance here, the 326,951, and I go back to my trade. Well, that's obviously not complete, so that must mean I have that other account that I have to look for. So I'll go ahead and pull up the payable other and see what's in its little bucket. Well, that's actually got a debit balance in it. So that's two different accounts. And just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the third to see what transactions might live in there. Well, that account is absolutely empty. So that's probably more of a financial summary account since there are no transactions in this particular period. So again, looking at the balances, even though this shows a negative, this means this is a credit balance in accounts payable. So I would have expected this number to be more on the order of a negative 326, but we see that it is not. So we see that we have some work to do, and we might want to figure out why this isn't there. Now, I rushed into doing reporting while I talked about receivables, but let me take a back step of some other things that we might need to look at. And one thing that is really important that we need to make sure of is that our friend, the daily transaction register, has been updated for all transactions that have posted up to this point. And what I recommend that you do, especially if you see a big disparity like what I'm showing on the AP side, is I would recommend that you come into the general ledger and you would run that daily transaction register, because running it from here is going to assure that you pick up any other source journals, whether it comes from PO or inventory or what have you, that it will allow you to effectively get those things logged on to the GL so that you can confirm what's going on. And we will see a couple of things here. I've got $324.20 worth of accounts receivable that didn't affect the East warehouse. You may have to scroll back into the video, but that, I believe, is the number that we were off when we looked at our AR details and our AR general ledger. So that's a great sign. That's going to tell me that this is going to get AR corrected and we are in balance at the end of the period that we were looking at. Unfortunately, payables is a far cry from where we need it to be. So again, this is where we start to deploy other tools. Let's go look at our AP trial balance, and let us see if that matches our aging report. Theoretically, it should. And theoretically also, we're going to run these things out to infinity in order to decide what is not correct. So as I get this report pulled up here, and again, zoom it in for everybody, I go look at the end, and my invoice balance is basically $326,951.18. Well, we know that that's nowhere close to the GL, but it does match our aging report balance. So again, this gives me some confidence that the general ledger is what is out of whack and would subsequently need to be adjusted. From there, you have to do some homework and you have to figure out what transactions may have occurred. Again, look through your account transactions, see if there are any non-Sage source related transactions, i.e. look for some journal entries that may have been made manually. Obviously, again, look back at the GL daily transaction register, make sure that those all get updated. And from there, you can start to build confidence that your general ledger and your details are matching, and therefore your financial statements should be more correct. So I hope you folks were able to glean a little bit out of this, figure out some ideas, realize that balancing your AR and your AP to your general ledger should be a task that you're performing on some sort of regular basis. You certainly don't want to go a couple of years without getting, or even a few months without getting those things dialed in, because the longer it is between times that you reconcile, the more difficult it will be to reconcile. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for watching this particular video. And certainly if you have any questions, feel free to contact us at DWD Technology Group. We are more than willing to lend a hand where we can. Thank you.